The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Buckingham Palace as tourists gathered behind the metal barriers. Among them stood Karen Mitchell, a 42-year-old woman from Ohio who had saved for 3 years to take this dream vacation to London. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a tight ponytail, and she wore a bright pink tracksuit that made her stand out among the more conservatively dressed crowd. Karen had always been the type of person who demanded attention. Back home in Cleveland, she was known for her loud voice at PTA meetings and her habit of asking to speak to managers whenever things didn't go her way. She believed the world owed her special treatment, and she wasn't shy about demanding it. "This is ridiculous," she complained loudly to her husband, Mike, who stood beside her looking embarrassed. "We've been standing here for 20 minutes, and nothing's happening. I thought we were supposed to see the changing of the guard." Mike, a quiet man who had learned over their 15 years of marriage to avoid confronting his wife, simply nodded and checked his watch. "The ceremony starts in 10 minutes, honey. Maybe we should just wait a little longer." But Karen wasn't in a waiting mood. She had spent good money on this trip, and she expected to get her money's worth. The royal guards, standing at their posts, looked like living statues in their red tunics and tall black bearskin hats. They stood perfectly still, staring straight ahead with blank expressions. "Look at them," Karen said with a sneer. "They think they're so important just standing there doing nothing. I bet they can't even speak English properly." One of the guards, positioned about 15 feet away from the barrier, was a young man named James Whitfield. At 25, James had been serving in the Queen's Guard for 3 years. He came from a working-class family in Manchester, and joining the military had been his way of building a better life for himself. He took his duty seriously and felt honored to protect the royal family. James could hear Karen's complaints, but he had been trained to ignore such comments. Tourists often tried to get reactions from the guards, and maintaining composure was part of the job. He focused on a point in the distance and kept his breathing steady. Karen noticed that the guards seemed to be ignoring her completely. This only made her more frustrated. She was used to getting reactions from people, and the guards' professional indifference felt like a personal insult. "Mike, take a picture of me with that guard," she demanded, pulling out her phone. "I want to show the girls back home." Mike reluctantly took the phone and pointed it toward his wife. Karen immediately began posing and making faces, trying to get the guard's attention. She waved at him, made silly expressions, and even stuck out her tongue. James remained perfectly still. "He's not even looking," Karen complained. "What's wrong with him? Is he blind?" An elderly British woman standing nearby heard Karen's comments and spoke up politely. "Excuse me, but the guards aren't allowed to interact with tourists. They're on duty protecting the palace." Karen whirled around to face the woman, her face flushing red. "I wasn't talking to you, lady. Mind your own business." The British woman looked shocked at Karen's rudeness, but decided not to escalate the situation. She moved away from Karen and found another spot to watch from. This interaction only made Karen more determined to get a reaction from the guard. She had been embarrassed in front of strangers, and now she felt like she needed to prove something. In her mind, the guard's silence was making her look foolish. "Watch this," she told Mike with a wicked grin. "I bet I can make him move." Before Mike could stop her, Karen ducked under the barrier rope. Several tourists gasped and pointed, but Karen ignored them. She marched directly toward James, who could see her approaching in his peripheral vision but maintained his position. "Hey, you!" Karen shouted when she was just a few feet away from James. "I'm talking to you! Can't you hear me?" James had dealt with tourists who crossed the barriers before. The protocol was clear. Remain at post unless there was a genuine threat, and let security handle any disruptions. He could see 2 police officers moving toward his position, but they were still about 30 seconds away. Karen stepped even closer, now standing directly in front of James. She waved her hands in front of his face and started making loud noises. "Hello? Earth to guard, boy. Anybody home in there?" When James still didn't react, Karen's frustration boiled over. She had never been ignored like this in her life, and something inside her snapped. Without thinking about the consequences, she raised her hand and slapped James hard across the face. The sound of the slap echoed across the courtyard like a gunshot. Every tourist in the area turned to stare, and several people started taking photos and videos with their phones. James's head had turned slightly from the force of the blow, and a red mark was already forming on his left cheek. For a moment, everything was silent. Karen stood there with her hand still raised, breathing heavily. She expected the guard to finally break his silence and yell at her, or maybe even push her away. But James simply turned his head back to its original position and resumed his stoic stance. This lack of reaction made Karen even angrier. "Are you kidding me?" she screamed. "I just hit you, and you're going to pretend it didn't happen? What kind of man are you?" The two police officers reached the scene just as Karen raised her hand to hit James again. "Ma'am, step away from the guard immediately," one of them commanded in a firm voice. Karen spun around to face the officers. "About time someone showed up. This guard is broken or something. I've been trying to get his attention, and he won't even acknowledge me." "Ma'am, you are not allowed to touch or harass the guards," the second officer explained. "Please return to the designated viewing area." "I paid good money to be here," Karen shot back. "I should be able to take pictures with whoever I want. This is supposed to be customer service." Mike finally found his courage and approached his wife. "Karen, please, let's just go back behind the rope. You're making a scene." "Don't tell me what to do," Karen yelled at her husband. "I'm not going anywhere until someone explains to me why this guard thinks he's too good to talk to paying customers." The crowd of tourists had grown larger, and many were now openly filming the confrontation. Karen seemed to relish the attention, even though it was negative. She had always believed that any attention was better than no attention. Meanwhile, James continued to stand at his post, but inside, his mind was racing. He had been trained to handle many situations, but being physically assaulted by a tourist was something he had never experienced before. His face stung from the slap, and he could feel his heart beating faster, but his military discipline kept him from reacting. What Karen didn't know was that James came from a very different background than she assumed. His father had been a boxer, and James himself had served 2 tours in Afghanistan before joining the Queen's Guard. He had faced down armed insurgents and survived improvised explosive device attacks. A rude tourist, even one who had hit him, was not going to break his composure. The police officers were trying to de-escalate the situation, but Karen was becoming more belligerent by the minute. "I want to speak to whoever's in charge here," she demanded. "This guard has been completely unprofessional, and I want him fired." "Ma'am, the guard has done nothing wrong," the first officer explained patiently. "You, however, have committed assault by striking him. We need you to come with us." Karen's eyes widened in shock. "Assault? Are you serious? I barely touched him. Look at him. He doesn't even care." "Assault is assault, ma'am, regardless of the victim's reaction," the officer replied. "Please put your hands behind your back." This was the moment when Karen realized that her actions might have real consequences. Back home, she was used to getting her way through complaints and threats. She had never been arrested for anything more serious than a speeding ticket. Wait, she said, backing away from the officers. "This is all a misunderstanding. I was just trying to take a picture. I didn't mean to hurt anyone." But the officers had seen the entire incident, and there were dozens of witnesses. They moved forward to arrest Karen, but she decided to make one last desperate attempt to avoid consequences. "You can't arrest me," she shouted. "I'm an American citizen. I have rights. This guard probably isn't even a real soldier anyway. He's probably just some actor in a costume." This comment caused murmurs of outrage from the British tourists in the crowd. Insulting the Queen's Guard was something that did not sit well with the locals, and several people began voicing their disapproval of Karen's behavior. James, meanwhile, was fighting an internal battle. Every instinct told him to remain at his post and let the authorities handle the situation. But Karen's continued insults were testing his patience in ways that enemy fire never had. The truth was, James had earned several commendations during his military service. He had saved the lives of 3 fellow soldiers during an ambush in Helmand Province and had been personally thanked by his commanding officer for his bravery under fire. He wore the uniform of the Queen's Guard with pride, knowing that he had earned the right to stand in that position. As the police officers moved to handcuff Karen, she made one final mistake. She pointed directly at James and shouted at the top of her lungs, "That man is a fake! He's not a real soldier! Real soldiers fight back when someone hits them!" Something in James's expression changed slightly. It was subtle, just a tiny tightening around his eyes. But it was the first crack in his professional facade. Karen's words had hit a nerve in a way that her physical assault had not. The officers successfully handcuffed Karen, despite her continued protests and struggles. As they prepared to lead her away, she continued hurling insults at James. "You're pathetic!" she yelled. "Standing there like a statue while a woman pushes you around. What would your mother think?" Mike tried to calm his wife down, but she was beyond reasoning with. The embarrassment of being arrested had only made her more desperate to save face, and she seemed to think that by attacking James's character, she could somehow justify her own actions. As Karen was led away, still shouting and complaining, James remained at his post. But the other tourists could see that something had changed. His jaw was clenched slightly tighter, and there was a new intensity in his stare. What none of them knew was that James's mother had died in a car accident just 6 months earlier. She had been his biggest supporter and had attended his passing out parade when he joined the Queen's Guard. Her last words to him had been about how proud she was of his service to his country. Karen's comment about his mother had crossed a line that even his military training couldn't completely ignore. For the first time since the incident began, James was genuinely angry. But he was also something else that Karen had completely failed to recognize. He was professional, disciplined, and smart. If Karen thought that hitting him and insulting his service and his family would go without consequences simply because he couldn't react while on duty, she was about to learn a very hard lesson about the British justice system. As the crowd began to disperse and normal activity resumed around the palace, James continued his duty. But in his mind, he was already planning what would happen next. Karen Mitchell had made the mistake of thinking that his silence meant weakness, and that his discipline meant he would simply forget what she had done. She was about to discover just how wrong she could be about someone she had judged so quickly and so harshly. The consequences of her actions were only beginning to unfold, and they would be far more serious than she could have ever imagined. 3 hours later, Karen sat in a sterile holding cell at Belgravia police station, still wearing her bright pink tracksuit that now seemed ridiculous in the harsh fluorescent lighting. Her husband Mike sat on a plastic chair in the waiting area, nervously checking his phone and wondering how their dream vacation had turned into such a nightmare. Detective Inspector Sarah Collins was reviewing the case file at her desk. At 45, she had seen plenty of tourist incidents during her 20-year career with the Metropolitan Police, but assault on a royal guard was something different entirely. The videos from witnesses' phones had already been uploaded to the station's system, and they showed the incident clearly from multiple angles. "This is going to be a mess," Collins muttered to her partner, Detective Sergeant Tony Morrison. "The woman actually thinks she can assault a Queen's Guard and walk away with a warning." Morrison looked up from his computer screen. "I've been checking her background. Karen Mitchell, married, 2 kids, works part-time at a dental office in Cleveland. No serious criminal record, just a few complaints from neighbors about noise, and one incident where she was asked to leave a restaurant for yelling at staff. Entitled behavior," Collins observed. "Probably thinks the rules don't apply to her because she's a tourist. What about the guard?" That's where it gets interesting, Morrison said, pulling up another file. Lance Corporal James Whitfield, Welsh Guards. 3 years with the Queen's Guard, but before that he did 6 years in regular service, including 2 deployments to Afghanistan. Military Cross recipient. Collins raised her eyebrows. Military Cross? What for? Morrison read from the screen. Says here he single-handedly held off an enemy attack for 4 hours after his unit was ambushed. Saved the lives of 3 wounded soldiers and called in air support that prevented the entire patrol from being overrun. The citation mentions extraordinary courage under fire and selfless devotion to duty. And this American tourist thought she could bully him, Collins said with a shake of her head. Has anyone told her who she messed with? Not yet. Her lawyer should be here soon, though. Meanwhile, Karen was pacing back and forth in her cell, getting more agitated by the minute. She had expected to be released with an apology and maybe a stern warning. The reality of spending hours in custody was starting to sink in, and she didn't like it one bit. "Guard!" she shouted toward the door. "I want to make a phone call. This is harassment. I'm an American citizen." The custody sergeant, a patient man named Williams who had dealt with thousands of difficult prisoners over the years, opened the slot in the door. "Mrs. Mitchell, you've already made your phone call. Your lawyer is on the way." "I don't need a lawyer," Karen snapped. "I need someone with common sense who can explain to these people that this whole thing is blown out of proportion." "Ma'am, assaulting a royal guard is a serious offense. The lawyer will help explain your options." Karen's face turned red. "I didn't assault anyone. I gave him a little tap because he was being rude. Where I come from, customer service means you acknowledge the customers." Williams had heard enough. He closed the slot and walked away, leaving Karen to continue her rant to the empty cell. An hour later, Karen's court-appointed lawyer arrived. Jennifer Barnes was a sharp woman in her 30s who specialized in tourist-related legal issues. She had defended everyone from drunk football fans to shoplifters, but assault on a royal guard was a new one even for her. Barnes sat across from Karen in the interview room and opened her briefcase. "Mrs. Mitchell, I'm Jennifer Barnes, and I've been assigned to represent you. We need to discuss the charges against you." "Finally," Karen said with relief, "someone who can get me out of this mess. These people are treating me like I'm some kind of terrorist just because I tried to interact with their fancy guard." Barnes pulled out the police report and several printed photos from the witness videos. "Mrs. Mitchell, you need to understand the seriousness of what happened. You're being charged with assault on a member of Her Majesty's Armed Forces while they were performing their duty. This is not a minor offense." Karen glanced at the photos showing her slapping James. "That's ridiculous. Look how big he is compared to me. I couldn't hurt him if I tried." "The size difference is irrelevant," Barnes explained patiently. "Assault is defined as any unwanted physical contact. The fact that he's a royal guard makes it an aggravated offense. You could be looking at up to 6 months in prison." Karen's mouth dropped open. "Prison? Are you insane? For one little slap? This country is crazy." "Mrs. Mitchell, I need you to listen carefully. The Crown Prosecution Service takes these cases very seriously. The Royal Guards are symbols of British sovereignty, and attacking one is considered an attack on the Crown itself." "That's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard," Karen said, though her voice was starting to show signs of worry. "It's just a job. He's just a guy in a fancy costume." Barnes sighed. This was going to be more difficult than she had hoped. "Mrs. Mitchell, Lance Corporal Whitfield is a highly decorated war veteran. He's not just a guy in a costume. He served his country with distinction in combat zones." "How was I supposed to know that?" Karen protested. "He was just standing there like a dummy." "That's called doing his job," Barnes replied sharply. "Royal Guards are trained to remain motionless and focused regardless of distractions. Your behavior was exactly the kind of thing they're trained to ignore." Karen was quiet for a moment, finally beginning to realize that she might be in real trouble. Okay, so what happens now? Can we just pay a fine and go home? Barnes shook her head. It's not that simple. The CPS will want to make an example of this case. Tourist assaults on royal guards can't be tolerated, or it would set a dangerous precedent. But I'm just a regular person, Karen pleaded. I made a mistake. Can't they see that? Mrs. Mitchell, there were dozens of witnesses and multiple video recordings. You didn't just make a mistake. You deliberately crossed a security barrier, approached a guard despite warnings from police, assaulted him, and then continued to insult him and his service even after you were arrested. Karen felt tears starting to form in her eyes as the weight of her situation became clear. What about my family? My kids are expecting me to come home next week. I have a job to get back to. That's why we need to discuss your plea options. If you plead guilty and show genuine remorse, the court might consider a suspended sentence or community service instead of actual prison time. Plead guilty? Karen's voice rose again. I'm not admitting to assault when all I did was try to get someone's attention. Barnes rubbed her temples, feeling a headache coming on. Mrs. Mitchell, the evidence is overwhelming. Pleading not guilty will only make things worse. The judge will see the videos, hear from dozens of witnesses, and consider your complete lack of remorse. You'll get the maximum sentence. Before Karen could respond, there was a knock on the door. Sergeant Williams entered and addressed Barnes. Excuse me, counselor, but there's been a development. Lance Corporal Whitfield has submitted a victim impact statement. Barnes looked surprised. Already? That was fast. Yes, ma'am. And there's something else. The victim has requested to address the court personally when this goes to trial. Karen looked confused. What does that mean? Barnes felt her heart sink. In her experience, when a victim requested to speak in court, it usually meant they had something powerful to say. It means Lance Corporal Whitfield wants to tell the judge directly how your actions affected him. Affected him? Karen scoffed. He didn't even react when I slapped him. How could it have affected him? Williams cleared his throat. Ma'am, if I may, just because someone doesn't react doesn't mean they weren't affected. Lance Corporal Whitfield is a professional soldier. His training taught him not to react to provocation, but that doesn't mean what you didn't hurt him. This was the first time anyone had suggested to Karen that her actions might have actually caused real harm. She had been so focused on James's lack of reaction that she assumed he hadn't been bothered by what she did. I want to see this victim statement, Karen demanded. Barnes shook her head. That's not how it works. The statement will be presented to the court, but you don't get to see it beforehand. This is insane, Karen muttered. In America, I'd have the right to know what I'm being accused of. You're not in America, Williams pointed out. And you're not being accused of anything new. You assaulted a royal guard in front of dozens of witnesses. The victim's statement is about how that assault affected him personally. After Williams left, Barnes tried one more time to make Karen understand her situation. Mrs. Mitchell, I strongly advise you to consider pleading guilty and showing genuine remorse. If Lance Corporal Whitfield is requesting to speak in court, he probably has something important to say. Combined with his military record and the clear video evidence, fighting these charges would be futile. Karen was quiet for several minutes, finally starting to grasp the seriousness of her predicament. What kind of sentence are we talking about if I plead guilty? With no prior serious convictions and if you show genuine remorse, possibly a suspended sentence and community service, maybe a fine. But if you fight it and lose, which you will, you're looking at actual jail time. And if I don't fight it? Then we focus on mitigating factors. You're a tourist who made a poor decision. You have children at home. You've never been in trouble like this before. The court might show leniency. Karen put her head in her hands. For the first time since the incident began, she was starting to understand that her actions had real consequences. The guard she had dismissed as just a guy in a costume was apparently a decorated war hero, and the British legal system was not going to treat her assault as a minor tourist mishap. I want to know more about this guard, she said quietly. If I'm going to plead guilty, I need to understand what I did. Barnes nodded. This was the first sign of progress she had seen. I can request his service record for sentencing purposes. It might help the court see that you understand the gravity of assaulting someone who has served his country with such distinction. He really won some kind of medal? Karen asked. The Military Cross. It's one of the highest awards for gallantry that can be awarded to members of the British Armed Forces. It's only given for extraordinary heroism in combat. Karen was quiet again. In her mind, she had pictured the Royal Guard as some kind of ceremonial figure, like a theme park employee. Learning that he was a genuine war hero who had risked his life to save others made her feel sick to her stomach. What exactly did he do to earn it? She asked softly. Barnes consulted her notes. According to the public citation, he held off an enemy attack single-handedly for 4 hours after his patrol was ambushed. He kept fighting even after being wounded, and he saved the lives of 3 fellow soldiers. The citation mentions that his actions prevented the entire patrol from being wiped out. Karen felt tears running down her cheeks. And I called him a fake soldier. I said he wasn't a real man. Yes, you did, and that's probably going to be in his victim impact statement. For the first time since the whole ordeal began, Karen felt genuine shame about her behavior. She had spent so much time being angry about being ignored that she hadn't considered the possibility that the guard might actually be a good person who deserved respect. What happens now? She asked quietly. Now we prepare for your court appearance. And Mrs. Mitchell, when we go before the judge, I need you to show the same remorse you're showing now. The court needs to see that you understand what you did was wrong. Karen nodded, wiping her eyes. I want to apologize to him. To the guard. Is that possible? Barnes looked surprised. This was another positive development. It might be possible to include an apology in your statement to the court. But Mrs. Mitchell, it has to be genuine. Judges can tell the difference between real remorse and someone just trying to reduce their sentence. It would be genuine, Karen said firmly. I made a terrible mistake. I judged him without knowing anything about him, and I was completely wrong. As Barnes packed up her files, she felt cautiously optimistic. If Karen could maintain this attitude and convince the judge that her remorse was real, she might avoid jail time. But the case was far from over. And Lance Corporal James Whitfield still had his say in court. What neither Karen nor her lawyer knew was that James's victim impact statement contained information that would shock everyone in the courtroom and completely change how the case was viewed. The decorated war hero had more to say about Karen's assault than anyone expected, and his words would ensure that this case became something much bigger than a simple tourist incident. 2 weeks later, Westminster Magistrates' Court was packed with an unusual mix of spectators. Local news reporters had picked up the story of the American tourist who assaulted a royal guard, and the case had attracted attention from both British and international media. Karen sat in the defendant's dock wearing a conservative black dress, looking pale and nervous. Her husband Mike sat in the public gallery, having spent their entire vacation savings on legal fees. Judge Patricia Henderson, a stern woman in her 60s with over 30 years of experience on the bench, reviewed the case file one final time before the proceedings began. She had seen thousands of assault cases, but attacks on royal guards were rare and always taken seriously by the court system. "All rise," called the court clerk as Judge Henderson entered the courtroom. Karen stood on shaky legs, feeling the weight of dozens of eyes on her. The past 2 weeks had been the worst of her life. The incident had gone viral on social media, with videos of her slapping the guard being viewed millions of times around the world. She had been fired from her job at the dental office after patients complained about being served by someone who had attacked British royalty. Her children were being teased at school, and her neighbors had turned cold toward her family. Please be seated, Judge Henderson said. We are here today for the case of Regina versus Karen Mitchell, charged with assault on a member of Her Majesty's Armed Forces. How does the defendant plead? Karen's lawyer, Jennifer Barnes, stood up. Your Honor, the defendant pleads guilty to the charge. A murmur went through the courtroom. Karen had spent sleepless nights deciding to plead guilty, finally accepting that fighting the charges would only make things worse. The evidence was overwhelming, and she was beginning to understand the seriousness of what she had done. Judge Henderson nodded. Very well. Before I pass sentence, I understand that the victim, Lance Corporal James Whitfield, has requested to address the court personally. That is correct, Your Honor, said the prosecutor, a sharp-dressed woman named Margaret Thornton, who specialized in cases involving military personnel. Please call Lance Corporal Whitfield to the stand. The courtroom fell silent as James entered through the side door. He was not wearing his ceremonial red tunic today, but instead wore his service dress uniform with its neat rows of ribbons and medals. Karen saw him clearly for the first time without his bearskin hat and was surprised to see how young he looked. His military bearing was unmistakable, though. He walked with perfect posture and looked directly ahead as he approached the witness stand. As James passed the defendant's dock, Karen got her first close look at the man she had assaulted. She could see a small scar on his left temple and noticed that he walked with the slightest hint of a limp. These were not details she had observed during their brief encounter at the palace. James raised his right hand and was sworn in. When he spoke, his voice was clear and steady, with a slight northern English accent. Your Honor, James began, 2 weeks ago, while I was performing my duties as a member of the Queen's Guard at Buckingham Palace, I was physically assaulted by the defendant. But I'm not here today to talk about the slap itself. Karen looked up sharply, surprised by his opening statement. James continued, What happened after the assault is what I want the court to understand. The defendant shouted several things at me while I maintained my post. She called me a fake soldier. She said I wasn't a real man because I didn't fight back when she hit me. She suggested that my mother would be ashamed of me. The courtroom was completely silent. Karen felt her cheeks burning with shame as she remembered her words. Your Honor, 6 months ago, my mother passed away from cancer. She was 62 years old, and she fought her disease with more courage than I've seen from hardened soldiers in combat zones. The last conversation I had with her was about how proud she was that I served in the Queen's Guard. She said it was the greatest honor she could imagine for her son. James paused, and Karen could see him take a steadying breath. The defendant couldn't have known about my mother's death, of course, but when she used my mother's memory to try to shame me for doing my duty, it hurt more than any physical blow could have. It hurt more than the shrapnel I took in Afghanistan. It hurt more than watching my friends get wounded in combat. Karen felt sick to her stomach. She had been so focused on her own embarrassment and anger that she hadn't considered that her words might cause real pain. James looked directly at Karen for the first time. But I want the court to know that I don't hate the defendant. I've seen real evil in this world, Your Honor. I've faced people who wanted to kill me and my friends for no other reason than the uniform we wore. Mrs. Mitchell is not evil. She's a person who made a very poor decision and said hurtful things without thinking about the consequences. The judge leaned forward slightly, clearly interested in where James was heading with his statement. Your Honor, I've been thinking about this case for 2 weeks. At first I was angry, not about being slapped. I've been through much worse than that. I was angry about being called a fake soldier and having my mother's memory used against me. But then I realized something important. James turned back to face the court. The defendant's behavior wasn't really about me at all. It was about her own frustration and embarrassment. She was in a foreign country trying to have a good time, and when things didn't go the way she expected, she lashed out. That doesn't excuse what she did, but it helps me understand it. Karen was crying quietly now, but she didn't look away from James. She needed to hear what he had to say. "Your Honor, I want to tell you about the day I earned my military cross. My patrol was ambushed in Helmand Province. We were pinned down by enemy fire, and 3 of my mates were seriously wounded. For 4 hours, I held our position while calling in air support. I did what I had to do to protect my brothers in arms." James's voice remained steady, but Karen could hear the emotion underneath. "But here's what the citation doesn't say. I was terrified the entire time. I wanted to run. I wanted to hide. The only thing that kept me fighting was the knowledge that if I gave up, good men would die." He looked around the courtroom. "Courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about doing the right thing even when you are afraid. And standing at my post while being insulted and assaulted by a tourist? That's not courage, Your Honor. That's just training." Judge Henderson was listening intently. "What is your point, Lance Corporal?" "My point, Your Honor, is that real courage is admitting when you're wrong and taking responsibility for your actions. Mrs. Mitchell has pleaded guilty today. She could have fought these charges, forced us all through a trial, and tried to minimize her responsibility. Instead, she's here accepting the consequences of what she did. That takes a different kind of courage." Karen looked up in surprise. She hadn't expected the guard to say anything positive about her. James continued, "I'm not asking for leniency, Your Honor. That's not my place. But I want the court to know that holding grudges and seeking revenge isn't what I fought for in Afghanistan. I fought for the idea that people can be better than their worst moments." The prosecutor, Margaret Thornton, stood up. "Your Honor, if I may ask Lance Corporal Whitfield a question?" "Proceed." "Lance Corporal, do you believe the defendant has shown genuine remorse for her actions?" James looked at Karen thoughtfully. "I can't read minds, ma'am. But I can tell you that the woman who assaulted me was angry, loud, and seemed to think the world owed her something. The woman sitting in that dock today looks like someone who has had time to think about what she did and doesn't like what she discovered about herself." Judge Henderson made some notes before speaking. "Thank you, Lance Corporal Whitfield. That was a very thoughtful statement. You may step down." As James returned to his seat, Karen felt compelled to speak. She stood up suddenly, surprising her lawyer. "Your Honor, may I say something?" Judge Henderson looked stern. "Mrs. Mitchell, you are represented by counsel. Any statement should come through your attorney." Barnes quickly stood up. "Your Honor, my client has prepared a statement that she would like to read to the court." "Very well, but keep it brief." Karen's hands were shaking as she unfolded a piece of paper. She had written and rewritten her statement dozens of times over the past 2 weeks. "Your Honor, and Lance Corporal Whitfield, I am deeply ashamed of my behavior. When I went to London, I thought I was just a tourist having fun. I didn't think about the fact that the Royal Guards are real people with real lives and real feelings." Karen's voice cracked slightly. "I was rude, I was disrespectful, and I was completely wrong about who Lance Corporal Whitfield is. I called him names that were not only false, but insulting to someone who has served his country with such honor. I brought up his mother without knowing anything about his personal life, and I now know how hurtful that was." She looked directly at James. "Lance Corporal Whitfield, I can't undo what I said or did, but I want you to know that I have learned something important from this experience. My behavior reflected badly, not just on me, but on my country and my family. My children are ashamed of what their mother did, and they should be." Karen folded her statement and sat down. The courtroom remained quiet for several moments. Judge Henderson cleared her throat. "This has been an unusual case in many respects. Mrs. Mitchell, your assault on Lance Corporal Whitfield was inexcusable. Royal Guards perform an important ceremonial and security function, and they must be able to do their jobs without fear of being attacked by tourists or anyone else." Karen braced herself for the sentence. "However," the judge continued, "I have been impressed by Lance Corporal Whitfield's statement, and by your apparent genuine remorse. This court does not exist solely to punish wrongdoing. It also exists to help people learn from their mistakes and become better citizens. Judge Henderson consulted her notes. Mrs. Mitchell, I sentence you to 6 months imprisonment, suspended for 2 years. This means you will not go to jail unless you commit another offense within the next 2 years. You are also sentenced to 200 hours of community service, which you may complete in your home country, and you are fined $2,000. Karen felt a wave of relief that she wouldn't be going to prison. But the judge wasn't finished. Additionally, you are banned from entering the United Kingdom for a period of 5 years. When that ban expires, any future visit to the UK will be subject to immigration review. The reality of the sentence hit Karen like a physical blow. 5 years banned from the country meant she couldn't return to make amends or show that she had changed. It was a permanent consequence of her 30 seconds of bad judgment. Furthermore, Judge Henderson continued, I am ordering that you write a formal letter of apology to the commanding officer of the Welsh Guards, acknowledging your assault on one of their members and your disrespectful comments about the regiment. After the judge left and the courtroom began to empty, Karen found herself face to face with James in the hallway. Mike stood nervously behind his wife, not sure what to expect. Lance Corporal Whitfield, Karen began, her voice barely above a whisper. I know an apology can't fix what I did, but I need you to know that I am truly sorry, not just for hitting you, but for everything I said. You didn't deserve any of it. James studied her face for a moment. Mrs. Mitchell, we all make mistakes. The measure of a person isn't whether they make mistakes, it's how they respond when they realize they've made them. I'll never forgive myself for what I said about your mother, Karen said, tears flowing again. I had no right. My mother would have forgiven you, James replied quietly. She believed in second chances and in the power of people to change. If you really want to honor her memory, use this experience to become a better person. Karen nodded, unable to speak. Good luck with your community service, James said. I hope you find a way to turn this experience into something positive. As James walked away, Karen felt the weight of her actions settle fully on her shoulders. The man she had dismissed as just a guy in a costume had shown her more grace and dignity than she had shown him. He was everything she had falsely accused him of not being. A real soldier, a real man, and someone any mother would be proud to call her son. 6 months later, Karen was halfway through her community service at a veteran support center in Cleveland. She had requested specifically to work with military families, and she spent her time helping with fundraisers and support programs. She never told anyone about her connection to the military through her legal troubles, but she found deep meaning in the work. Her marriage had survived the ordeal, though it had been tested. Mike had been forced to take a second job to pay the legal fees and the fine. Their children had learned a hard lesson about consequences and public behavior from their mother's mistakes. Karen kept a photo on her desk at home, not of her family or friends, but a newspaper clipping showing James receiving his military cross. She had found the photo online and printed it as a reminder of the kind of person she had wronged and the kind of person she wanted to become. She never returned to London. Even after her 5-year ban expired, she couldn't bring herself to go back. But she often thought about James and hoped that he was doing well. She had learned that real strength wasn't about demanding attention or getting your way. It was about standing quietly in service to something greater than yourself, even when ignorant people questioned your worth. The Royal Guard she had so carelessly judged and assaulted had taught her the most important lesson of her life. That true dignity comes not from forcing others to acknowledge you, but from conducting yourself with honor, whether anyone is watching or not.